So very often we think about mental health and mental ill health as two different things. But I want to suggest they're actually quite closely connected. And I want to begin by pointing out that the Bible doesn't have a word for the biomedical understanding of health as the absence of illness, as we oftentimes talk about. The closest word that the scripture has is the term shalom, which basically means justice, righteousness, holiness, right relationship with God. So to be healthy mentally or physically is to be in right relationship with God. So you can be a fantastic athlete and be really unhealthy. And you could be dying of cancer and be really healthy if you have your relationship with God sorted out. And that's really, really helpful when we're thinking about mental health, and particularly enduring long-term mental health issues, where people will never necessarily be free from their symptoms, but we can still find health in that spiritual space, if you like. So I want you to hold that model in mind. So mental health is not the absence of anything, it's the presence of God. And that's important because sometimes we always think about, tempted to think about mental health, mental ill health in terms of something's missing. It's not something present, we bring something to it. Mental health is not an ideal, a concept or a goal, it's a relationship. It's a relationship with God, and it's a relationship with you and I and our communities. So therefore, we get our identity, we get a sense of being loved from our community. So health, to be healthy, is to be part of your community, as well as to be overcoming particular issues. So it's a theological concept. It's something to do with how we understand and relate to God. And the presence of God, and this is important, is revealed in human relationships. As we engage with one another, so people experience God. So that model of health, I want you just to keep in mind. And we could think about it in mental health like as a continuum, moving from positive, healthy functioning to severe mental illness causing distress. But the key thing is, all of us are on that continuum. It's not like some people over here are creatures called people with mental illness, and some people over here are creatures called people who don't have that. We all run along there. It's just when we get to that red line there that we need help, that we need professional help, but we also need help from our community. So we're thinking along that continuum. That's it. All of us are on there. All of us need help at certain points in our lives. So mental health as a relationship, mental health as a continuum is the thing I want you to think about. Now, one of the most devastating aspects of mental health and mental ill health is stigma. Stigma reduces the person to the size of their diagnosis. It comes originally from the Greek slave trade, where a slaver would buy a person and then put the mark on them, and they would be reduced to that mark. They'd no longer have a name, they'd no longer have a person, they would simply be reduced to that mark. And stigma does that. And stigma is one of the most profoundly devastating aspects of mental health. But stigma comes from community. No amount of professional intervention can take away stigma. It's up to communities and people like us to think differently. And one of the most highly stigmatized conditions is something like schizophrenia. And I want to suggest to you through this presentation, and our focus on hearing voices, I want us to begin to destigmatize psychosis. Take away the caricatures and the assumptions and think differently. Not that it's less serious, just thinking differently. So my friend Alan Walker, he sadly died a couple of years ago, but his mum said I could use his story. It was a testimony to him. Alan was diagnosed with schizophrenia quite late on in life. He was in his 30s, if I remember correctly. I told me this story. He said, I went to the hospital and I've been having these strange, hearing voices, and having strange experiences. And eventually the doctor gave me a diagnosis. He said to me, you have schizophrenia. And Alan said, the first thing I thought was, how disappointing. Because that means that the rest of my life is just going to be ruined, or so he thought. So as soon as he heard that, he felt disappointed. And then he got the bus home and he sat beside a woman he sat beside many times before. And he said to her, you know, I've just been to the doctor and he's told me I have schizophrenia. And the woman stood up and left the bus. I never spoke to him again. And so he went home and he spoke to his mum and he explained the situation to his mum. And his mum said this. His mum said, Alan, you have schizophrenia, but you're not schizophrenic. You're Alan. You're my son. And I love you. And that just changed everything for him. Alan, you're my son, and I love you. And I think we're going to come back to that towards the end of the presentation, but that's the essence of good spiritual care. You are my friend, and I love you. Now, you can see how devastating stigma can be for the individual, the way they think, and for other people. So let's think about hearing voices. So the phenomenon of hearing voices occurs when a person hears a voice, either internally or externally, that's not heard by others around them. So it's associated with people with psychotic disorder. However, and this is the interesting point, a significant number of healthy individuals have also reported hearing voices. So something like, it's estimated that between 5% and 28% of any general population, that's people who are not in psychiatric care, hear voices that other people do not. So there's actually more people outside of professional care that hear voices than inside professional care. And those who hear voices within professional care, it's normally because they're causing distress. So it's not necessarily the voices themselves that's the problem, it's the distress that they cause that's the issue. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So my point is, people living with voices are not something else over here. It's actually quite a common phenomenon. Martin Luther King, towards at one point in his in ministry, he was about to give up. He'd had a really horrible threatening phone call, threatening him, threatening his kids. And he was sitting in his kitchen thinking, how am I going to go back to people and say that I've had enough? I'm going to let people down, but I can't do it anymore. And this is what happened. A voice came. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world. So it's interesting that many religious people hear voices, many people in times of crisis hear voices, and many people who suffer mental health challenges hear voices. So the phenomenon of hearing voices in itself is something that we all share. It's the distress that they cause that becomes problematic. There's a very interesting anthropologist who I think is at Stanford at the moment, called Tanya Luhrmann. And she wrote a really interesting book called When God Talks Back. And it's about evangelical Christians or charismatic Christians and the way in which they hear the voice of God. It's fascinating, the way they train themselves to hear the voice of God. But in the work that I wanted to focus on today, she did a really interesting cross-cultural study of the phenomenon of hearing voices. And so she looked at voice hearing in the United States, in India, and in Africa. She came up with some very interesting stuff. So it was comparative studies of psychotic experience in America, Chennai in India, and Accra in Ghana. This is what she found. She said the US patients almost all self-identified as schizophrenic and used the diagnosis to talk about their condition. They knew the textbook definitions of the condition and ideas about hereditary illness. Patients know that hearing voices is a sign that you're crazy, so they often try to conceal the experience. They dislike hearing voices and try to deny their existence. So probably all of us can resonate with that as a description. Certainly in the United Kingdom, many people would resonate with that as a description. However, she said, for Westerners, hearing voices is clearly indicative of insanity and therefore carries the cultural weight of such understanding, so it becomes highly stigmatized. But when she looks at other cultures, things begin to shift and change. One more thing on voices in America. Voices themselves are generally unknown. All of the subjects heard horrible voices telling them that they were worthless and should die. Sometimes voices told them to torture others or go to war or that they suffer sufferer should commit suicide or was destined for a horrible end, one patient referred to the suicide voice. So you see, there's a very particular and sharp and negative, difficult way in which the American people in her study experienced their voices. However, when she began to look across cultures, she saw something different. Hearing voices in India. Patients who were diagnosed with schizophrenia tended to hear annoying relatives who told them to get dressed up and clean. Kin formed the lion's share of voices, sometimes criticizing them, sometimes advising them, and keeping them company, consoling, or helping to motivate patients. Some of these voices were reassuring, even playful. Luhrmann says that the playful voices could even become imaginary companions. Indian families also don't treat people with schizophrenia as if they have a soul-destroying illness. In other words, they frame it differently. They keep people in community. They give people options and possibilities for work and for participating in community. And they don't use the same kind of language around schizophrenia that we may be tempted to do so. In Accra, Africa, positive voices are central to the experience. So in the US, they are treated as an aside. So some people have positive voices and some people have negative voices. In Africa, that becomes significant. In the US, in this study at least, she says they're not really taken seriously. Positive voices and negative voices, they're all kind of put together. In the US, they're treated as an aside, peripheral to their primary condition. In Accra, people even said that voices had kept them alive. In other words, when bad voices were shouting at them, the other voices had a different perspective. And my friend Alan that I mentioned earlier, he had that phenomenon a lot. Sometimes people would be the voice would be very, very negative, but at the same time, there were positive voices that were speaking to him and having a more supportive impact. So what might make the difference? Well, Luhrmann puts forward this as a hypothesis. First of all, people are encouraged to have different types of opportunities when they start hearing voices. I mean, it's interesting when you look at some of the research that indicates that people with schizophrenia are more likely to recover in an African context than in an American stroke European context. And one of the reasons for that is because they're kept in community, they're kept in relationship, and very often there are spaces made for them to do things that are productive. So Luhrmann picks up on that and says, there's a danger that as soon as you have a diagnosis, if it's stigmatized, you stigmatize yourself, society stigmatizes you, and then that limits your possibilities. In India, certainly, they tend not to use the term schizophrenia. So professionals will use it because they'll use standard treatments, but they tend not to use it within culture. And one of the problems with the term schizophrenia is not the way that it's used within psychiatry or psychology, but the way that it's presumed to be when it leaks out into society. So like my friend Alan on the bus, she tells this woman who has schizophrenia, she has a series of caricatures in her mind, and off she goes, and that's the end of the relationship. So they tend not to use the terms, they recognize the issues, but don't necessarily use the term. They have a different theory of mind, and this is quite interesting. So in Africa and India, in certain contexts, there's an openness about the mind. So people are used to hearing the ancestors, used to having your mind as connected to your community, rather than where in Western context, where your mind is very much enclosed within your cranium. There's a much more communal sense of mind. So when the research team asked American patients whether the voices were real, the question was easy for US subjects to answer. They recognized the distinction between real voices inside your head, in part because the mind was understood to be a closed space. Having some other agent in your mind was clearly a sign of illness or dysfunction, so the voices were extremely disconcerting. But they were less disconcerting in the other context because people are more used to the phenomenon of your mind not simply residing within the confines of your skull. So it's quite interesting the way that Tanya Luhrmann lays that out. Because what she's saying is Not that schizophrenia doesn't exist, or not that it's not a really serious condition. She's saying that the way that we are as a community, the way we treat one another, the way we accept or don't accept one another, the way we frame and understand voices makes a difference to the way that people experience. Let me give you an example from my own research. I spent some fascinating time in conversation with people living with schizophrenia. The one story, Alice's story, stands out for me as it's quite revealing. As did Alan's story, but this is quite revealing. So Alice had severe schizophrenia from a very early age, from just early teens, really. And she had all of the horrible symptoms. So she had terrible voices that would tell her to do awful things. She had strange thoughts, strange beliefs. And sometimes the voices would tell her to go to the supermarket and stand still. And so she'd stand there for hours. And she says, it was really, really embarrassing. And you can understand why that would be, but she had to obey the voices. It was difficult for her, very difficult for her, and difficult for her family. But then when she was in her early 20s, if I remember correctly, her voices and these experiences disappeared. Now, she puts it down to a group of women in her local church praying for her over time. And there were women praying for her over time, not praying for her healing, just praying for her. And she puts it down as the consequence of that. Her psychiatrist put it down suggested that she'd been misdiagnosed. So somewhere in between these two lies the truth. But the point is that she suddenly no longer had these experiences. Now, you might say, isn't that fantastic? She must be delighted, but she wasn't. She said, the first thing that I felt when I no longer had these voices, I felt lonely. Because for most of my life, I had this cacophony of noise, some of it good, some of it bad, and then suddenly I have nothing. And all that time before then, I didn't have any friends, because nobody, as she put it, nobody wants to be friends with a schizophrenic. So she found herself isolated, alone, and then this kind of strange community disappears too. But there's more to Alice's story. She said, one of the most painful things, she also said she was glad to get rid of the horrible voices, so it's not, she wasn't being idealistic, but she said, one of the most painful things was that one of my voices that came regularly to me, she called it Margaret, actually helped me, she said. When the bad voices would tell me to do terrible things and tell me I'm worthless and useless, she would help me and tell me that I'm worth something, that I'm valuable. And so she kind of had this really strange relationship. And of course, now that she no longer had these experiences, she had to explain to people how it is that she was having to grieve for someone that never existed in the first place. So if she told people that, she felt, well, they're going to think I'm psychotic again. But at the same time, she had to work that through herself. And it's quite interesting because if you speak to people who have lived with voices for some time and then whose medication takes them down or delves them down, sometimes that idea of loneliness just comes to the fore. It's partly because it's such an intense experience, but it's also partly because people don't have a social network. And they don't have a social network, not because of their schizophrenia necessarily, but because of the stigma, because of the avoidance, because of people moving away. So it's really interesting. So when you begin to listen to people's experience, like Alice, like Alan, you can see that yes, hearing voices is very difficult, painful, and horrible, but there are other dimensions in there that at least we need to listen to and to think about. There's a very interesting organization which began in Holland called the Hearing Voices Network, and it picks up in some of the stuff that I've been talking to you about. And it recognizes that a lot of people hear voices, and a lot of people manage them. And really, it's when people get into severe distress that they need to be treated in that sense. But at the same time, many people need to learn how to manage their voices on a day-to-day basis. And the Hearing Voices Network, which runs across the world, in the States and Europe, this is an interesting way in which people with psychosis come together to help to work, understand, and manage their voices. So you should check that out if you haven't come across it before. It's very interesting. So I'm coming towards the end of what I want to say to you, but there's two more things that I want to talk about. First thing is to do with shalom. I think if we're thinking about mental health ministries, we're talking about obviously partnering with psychiatry and psychology. That's very, very important. But what is it that we as faith communities bring to the table? And I think we bring to the table the idea of shalom. The idea that even though you're going to have to live with your condition for all of your life, you can live well. You can live with a community. You can live with the hope of God with you, even in the midst of the difficulties that you have. And I always remember when I was talking in a conference in Edinburgh years ago, and I was talking about this idea of shalom and mental health, the idea that being with God helps us to understand what health is. And a guy came up to me afterwards and he says, I've lived with schizophrenia for 52 years, he said, and I've never heard anybody say that. I always thought that I was a bad Christian. And I thought that's terrible, that people would actually think that. That's not the case. That's not why we have mental health challenges. God comes in to bring us relationship, to bring us back together. It's not because you're a bad Christian. It's simply because the world is the way that the world is. And God never abandons us. And that guy, when he said that, suddenly realized that. So if we're going to move towards shalom, we need to listen carefully. Don't presume that you know what somebody is experiencing just because they have a particular diagnosis. Listen carefully. Open your mind and prepare to learn something. Don't simply think you're always bringing things to people. Learn from people. What's it feel like to live with voices? How can I help you? How does that impact upon your faith life? How do we together live well, even in the midst of this trouble? And just to go back to Alan's mum, we've got to love one another. There's a really interesting philosopher called Joseph Pieper, and he's got a book called Faith, Hope, and Love. And in one part, he offers a definition of love that runs a little bit like this. It says, to love what somebody else is to say, it's good that you exist, and I'm glad that you are here. So wherever you are, if there's somebody beside you, say that to them, it's good that you exist, I'm glad that you're here. Because as soon as you do that, you open up that space for love. And one of the problems with stigma, and one of the problems with the way that people perceive mental health very often is it's the exact opposite, saying, it's not good that you're here, and I'm not glad that you exist. And the one thing that faith communities can bring that other people struggle perhaps to bring is love. It's good that you're here, and I'm glad that you exist. So one more thing before I head off into the Scottish night. This is a painting, I believe, of Pope Francis when he was a cardinal. And at the back of the painting, you can see that there's a gentleman with a glass of water. He's actually the person that painted the picture. And the glass of water represents foot washing. And so what you see here is one of the most powerful religious men in the world prostrating himself in front of one of the weakest people in the world, a young man who's dying of AIDS. Now look at his position. If he was towering above this little boy, he would see certain things from a position of power. He'd see some things, but he'd miss a lot. When he goes down and looks up, you can see the boy's face. You can hear what the boy's saying. You can understand his expression. He can open up the space to become a guest in the life of that young boy. And that's what I want to leave you with, is that when we're thinking about mental health and mental health ministries, we're thinking about a gentle rhythm between being a guest in other people's lives and being a host, inviting people into our lives and allowing people into their lives. And when we do that rhythm of guesting and hosting and guesting and hosting, then we learn things that we can't possibly learn if we just think that we have control over everything. So I'm just saying to you, love, guessing, hosting, listening, and hearing. So that's your challenge and my challenge and our challenge. Thank you for listening.
John, thank you very much. I love your talk, and I just want to let everybody know that if you were interested in what you heard today, there's a lot more of John Swinton on the internet, on YouTube. You've written a number of books. Everything I read and hear that you've done, I learned so much from. And you echo the many themes of this conference, but especially walking alongside people, companioning them, loving them, being in relationship. And it's one of the themes of this conference is the importance of community. And you've really underscored that. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
And next time, maybe someday you can come to San Antonio.
I'd like that. That'd be good. You get sunshine in the winter.
Yeah. We're going to take a short break here before our next speaker. And John, have a good evening.
Thank you. See you. Bye-bye.